We continue our lectures in theoretical course of English grammar. Lecture 4 is devoted to the study of basic notions of morphology, grammatical category, grammatical paradigm, and paradigmatic opposition. Then we'll discuss and analyze ways of grammatical word forming in modern English. We already know from the previous lecture that morphology is the study of internal structure of words and the rules by which words are formed. Notional words, first of all verbs and nouns, possess some morphemic features expressing grammatical, morphological meanings and determining the grammatical form of the word. Grammatical meanings are very abstract, very general. Therefore, the grammatical form is not confined to an individual word, but unites a whole class of words so that each word of the class expresses the corresponding grammatical meaning together with its individual concrete semantics. For instance, if we compare these two groups of verbs, dances, laughs, jumps, plays, shouts, etc., and the second group, danced, laughed, jumped, played, and shouted, we'll see that in the first group all the verbs have the same word form with the inflection s, which is polyfunctional as it marks the grammatical meanings of person, third person, number singular, and the present tense of the enumerated verbs, while they differ semantically, each of them having its own concrete lexical meaning. In the second group, danced, laughed, jumped, played, and shouted, the same verbs are given in the past tense form that's marked with the inflection ed. Thus, we can say that different grammatical forms express different grammatical meanings. The most general notions of linguistics, reflecting the most general properties of phenomena, are referred to as categorical notions. From the point of the theory of English grammar, it's important and relevant to discuss the notions that of a grammatical category, a categorical grammatical meaning, grammatical paradigm, and paradigmatic opposition. The most general meanings rendered by language and expressed by systemic correlations of grammatical word forms are interpreted in linguistics as categorical grammatical meanings. The categorical meaning unites the individual meanings of the correlated paradigmatic forms and is exposed through them. For instance, the categorical grammatical meaning of number of nouns is realized through the oppositional forms of singular and plural, such as dog and dogs, toy and toys, star and star, and so on. Or the categorical grammatical meaning of degrees of comparison of adjectives, which is realized through the oppositional forms of their positive, comparative, and superlative degrees. For instance, deep, deeper, deepest, small, smaller, smallest, charming, more charming, most charming, wonderful, more wonderful, most wonderful, and many others. Now, we can already formulate the notions of grammatical category and grammatical paradigm. Grammatical category is a system of concepts expressing a generalized grammatical meaning by means of paradigmatic correlation of grammatical forms. For instance, The grammatical category of tense of the verb is represented by the paradigmatic correlations of its present, past, and future forms, such as dance, dances, danced, and will dance, or jump, jumped, and will jump. The ordered set of grammatical word forms of a lexeme expressing a categorical meaning constitutes its grammatical paradigm. The correlated word forms within the paradigm are referred to as members of so-called grammatical opposition. The oppositional theory was originally formulated as a phonological theory, but later it was introduced into morphology. The opposition, in the linguistic sense, may be defined as a generalized correlation of lingual forms by means of which a certain grammatical meaning, in other words, function, is expressed. The correlated elements, that's members of the opposition, must possess two types of features, common and differential. Common features serve as the basis of contrast, while differential features immediately express the function in question, in other words, a grammatical meaning. For instance, the common feature of the oppositional paradigm of singular and plural nouns is the number which unites the correlated forms in one paradigm, whereas the grammatical meanings of singularity and plurality serve as the differential features for their opposition. By the number of members contrasted, oppositions are divided into binary, that's a two-member opposition, and more than binary, ternary, quaternary, etc. For instance, the grammatical categories of number and case of the noun and the pronoun, as well as the grammatical category of voice of the verb in English, and many others, are realized through binary oppositional paradigms, while the category of degrees of comparison of adjectives, or the category of mood of the verb, for instance conditional mood, is realized through a ternary, a three-member paradigm of the corresponding grammatical forms. Let's take a ternary paradigm of the grammatical category of degrees of comparison of adjectives, such as big, bigger, biggest, amusing, more amusing, most amusing, and so on. Or let's take conditional mood. If someone gives me money, I'll buy a new bag. If someone gave me money, I would buy a new bag. And if someone had given me money, I would have bought a new bag yesterday. The most important type of opposition is a binary opposition. It is formed by a contrasted pair of members, one of which is characterized by the presence of a certain differential feature, while the other member is characterized by the absence of this feature. The member in which the feature is present is called a marked or strong positive member, and it is commonly designated by the symbol plus. The member in which the feature is absent is called an unmarked or weak negative member of the paradigm, and it is commonly designated by the symbol minus. Thus, the strong member of the grammatical opposition is always marked as it contains a certain differential feature, while the weak member is unmarked as it is characterized by the absence of this feature. Let's consider the following example. we work hard every day, and we worked hard yesterday. The expression of the verbal present and past tenses is based on the apposition, the differential feature of which is inflectional suffix ed. This inflection, expressing the meaning of the past tense, marks the past form of the verb positively, we worked, while the present form is unmarked, we work. Or if we take the noun forms cats and cat, we can say that these two forms constitute a binary opposition in which the plural is marked or strong member, while the singular is unmarked, weak member of the opposition. However, there can be more than one marked member of the opposition when we have a ternary or a quaternary paradigm. For instance, in the ternary paradigm of the grammatical category of degrees of comparison of adjectives, such as pretty, prettier, prettiest, or happy, happier, happiest, the form of the positive degree is unmarked, and therefore it's a weak member of the opposition, whereas the forms of comparative and superlative degrees represent the marked, strong members of the ternary paradigmatic opposition. Thus, we have discussed basic morphological notions, that of a grammatical category and categorical meaning, as well as the notions of grammatical paradigm and paradigmatic opposition with its structural types. The second part of Lecture 4 is devoted to the analysis of ways of grammatical word forming in modern English. The means employed for building up member forms of categorical oppositions are traditionally divided into synthetical and analytical. Accordingly, the grammatical forms themselves are differentiated into synthetical and analytical ones too. Synthetical grammatical forms are based on the morphemic composition of the word, as in girls, toys, bigger, biggest, dances, eats, cried, shouted, etc., while analytical grammatical forms are built up by a combination of at least two words, one of which is a grammatical auxiliary and the other a content word with concrete lexical meaning. For instance, is buying, was bought, has been buying, and so on. Synthetical grammatical forms are based on inner inflection, outer inflection, and suppletivity. Correspondingly, the forms are referred to as inner inflectional, outer inflectional, and suppletive. Inner inflection or grammatical infixation is based on a vowel interchange which is not productive in modern English, but it's peculiarly employed in some of its basic, most ancient lexemes. Inner inflection is used to form the past indefinite and past participle of English irregular verbs, most of which represent the bulk of the Germanic strong verbs. It's also used in a few nouns of Old English origin to form their plural. For instance, irregular verbs, for instance, begin, began, begun, do, did, done, drive, drove, driven, give, gave, given, keep, kept, kept, sell, sold, sold, teach, taught, taught, and so on. And nouns man, man, goose, geese, foot, feet, louse, lice, mouse, mice, tooth, teeth, and woman and women. Outer inflection implies grammatical suffixation, as grammatical prefixation could only be observed in the Old English. Outer inflection is used to build up the plural form of numbers. For instance, cars, teachers, doctors, and the possessive form of the case of nouns, dogs, fathers, children's with apostrophe s, the person, number of verbs, sings, drinks, goes, tense, for instance, cold, dropped, played, participial and gerundial forms of the verb cutting, bringing, diving, and many others, and the comparison forms of the adjective and the adverb soft, softer, softest, fast, faster, fastest, hard, harder, hardest, and many others. Suppletivity is based on the correlation of different roots as a means of paradigmatic differentiation of grammatical category. Suppletivity implies the grammatical interchange of word roots, and this unites it with the inner inflection. Suppletivity is used in the following cases. First of all, it's used in the forms of the verbs such as be, am, is, are, was, and will, and go, and went. Secondly, it's used in the irregular forms of degrees of comparison of adjectives such as good, better, bad, worse, much, more, little, and less. And finally, it's used in some forms of the personal pronouns such as I and me, we and us, she and her. In a broader morphological interpretation, suppletivity can be recognized in paradigmatic correlations of some modal verbs. For instance, cannot be able to, mustn't have to, may and be love to. Some indefinite pronouns, as well as certain nouns of peculiar categorical properties such as man and person, etc., can be also treated in a similar way. For instance, the indefinite pronouns one and some are regarded as suppletive forms in sentences like one man came to the king and some men came to the king. As for analytical forms, which are so typical of modern English that they have made this language into the classical sample of lingual analytism, they deserve some special comments on their substance. The traditional analytical morphological form represents a combination of an auxiliary word with a basic word. The classical analytical forms in the English grammar are the following verbal forms. First, perfect forms. For instance, have gone, had gone. Continuous forms. Is going, was going. Perfect continuous forms such as have been going, had been going. Passive voice forms. Is built, was built. Interrogative forms of present and past indefinite such as do you go or did you go. Negative forms of present and past indefinite. You don't go. You did not go. Future tense forms with the auxiliaries shall and will. For instance, I shall or I will leave now. Shall I leave now? And so on. These analytical forms are treated as grammatically idiomatic forms whose relevant grammatical meaning is not immediately dependent on the meaning of their component elements taken apart. The auxiliaries have, be, and do in them have so utterly lost their original meanings of possession, existence, and performing something that they are considered as the most standard and indisputable analytical forms of English morphology. Having reviewed the ways of grammatical word forming, we can conclude that modern English belongs to analytical languages, since the majority of its categorical forms are built up by a combination of an auxiliary and a basic content word with its concrete lexical meaning. However, we should bear in mind that synthetical ways of grammatical word forming is equally important for the English language, as outer inflection is used to build up categorical forms of the verbal present and past tenses, as well as the categories of number and case of nouns and the degrees of comparison of adjectives, and the inner inflection is employed in the past indefinite and past participle forms of the irregular verbs and the oppositional paradigmatic forms of number of some Old English nouns. That's all for this lecture.